Tom Jane, the protomolecule, the Rocinante, Earth, Mars, and a whole assortment of Belta Lora Baratna, the Expanse. Peace and long life. Discovering the Expanse led to a couple of seasons of great thrill, a couple seasons of mixed feelings, and terrible tragedy after that. There's so much that could be covered in the Expanse. I want to break it down to a few things. What did they do well? The Expanse does an incredible job of universe building. It creates the idea of a world, a setting in time, the assorted surrounding things that make it a realistic time and place. They give you an entire map of what the solar system is like, about Earth, about Mars, about the people of the belt. It gives you an all-encompassing sort of world view attainable that includes the politics of Earth and Mars, the genius of the Belters who they went out of their way to make them a mixture of different types of population. There's some Chinese in there based on who migrated to the belt, and the language of the Belters, their dialect, the linguistics. All of this is well thought out and just brilliantly done. Brilliantly done. It gives you a whole universe in which you can be immersed, and it gave you this really heavy science fiction and politically, culturally charged. It's a view of the future. And it's not a view so optimistic as Star Trek, which obviously I'm a Trekker, but it is grittier and more realistic in many ways. And yet, it's not gritty in the sense of being violent or dark for no reason, such as we've seen the direction of Kurtzman Trek that I talk about so much elsewhere. It really is a realistic future that is attainable. It doesn't require vast distances to be traveled through space, although the ring system eventually allows some of that. It's a apprehendable, comprehensible future within the solar system, where we have within the solar system in which we have access to the resources of Earth, Mars, the belt, and beyond. We get the whole story of the protomolecule, which is a fascinating, in-depth sort of mystery involving finally having contact with extraterrestrial life, life from outside our system. In our system, all life having originated on Earth and spreading out from there. And it is sufficiently alien enough and mysterious enough and does weird things that it comes across as, for those of us that have not met extraterrestrials yet, it comes across as a very plausible extraterrestrial, much more so than a guy with pointed ears. God bless him. It's a great character for its own reasons and its own universe and its own story. But the Expanse gives us the protomolecule, the mystery eventually of the ring builders, and so forth. They do an incredible job of working out the storyline, making you care about the characters, even though I find Naomi very offensive, not just because she's so unattractive or hard in the eyes, to use the expression, but she's kind of a terrible character. She's the one that makes bad decisions. She keeps secrets from the others, and I could never figure out what Holden saw in her. Nevertheless, there's nothing about her is bad enough to ruin the story, and the story with Anderson Dawes and Fred Johnson and with Chrissy and with just, there's so much incredible stuff in The Expanse. It is a beautiful, well thought through science fiction universe and was just a joy to watch. And then it kind of went downhill. The things that they got wrong. And I will say this, as much as I'm always critiquing the shows that start out with a checklist and they're trying to be woke by today's standards and check all the boxes, I always say there's no way to write a show that will 999 times out of 1,000 will only produce garbage, because there has to be more flexibility. You have to care about something enough to be writing it, something that is beyond just the formula. The Expanse did a really good job of that. They did not give any impression of trying to check the boxes. The character of Chrissy, tripping over my tongue tonight, Avasarala, She's a, wow, what an incredible character. The fact that she's a woman and has power is really sort of superfluous. It is the future. They don't really talk about that. And yet she's just written in a way that she is a total badass. Now, after a couple seasons, they started to slide her to the direction of, there were times it was like, come on, there's a line between badass and psychopath, and she's not coming across well. The last season, abbreviated though it was, and terrible in so many other ways, I felt like it came back a little bit to her normalcy as a badass character and a good leader and a smart leader and a crafty leader. That I had no problem with that. Bobby Draper, having this woman who's a Martian super soldier, Martian Marine. They had all that equipment. I mean, she's practically Iron Man. I didn't feel like anything was overly unrealistic about having her be a woman in that sort of action role, given the circumstances. And the character of Alex, which that was a big mistake. The actor having never been, there was nothing that ever came out about him that was proven to my knowledge. I've heard nothing, but they fired him pretty quick, and he was a very important part of the story. But Alex is this guy, he's from Mars, he's a veteran, he looks Middle Eastern, perhaps Indian, and he's a big fan of classic country music from the 20th century. Like, he is this image of the future that is, he's some sort of human Middle Eastern cultural type, ethnic type. He's a fan of country music. He's actually from Mars because he immigrated there. I mean, this is a guy that's the future. And in a really woke show or a woke movie, they would have had him not be a country fan. Or they would have made some crack about it so that they could interject an excuse for why he liked it, because it was all a bunch of dead white people. There'd be something truly cringeworthy like that if it was a woke show, but it's not. It's a lot more like the classic Star Trek, where you had a variety of people, and the whole point was you learned to love them as people in the roles they were in the crew or on the show, rather than for what they were, but who they were. And the character of Alex, great example of this. Chrissy Avasarala comes off great like that. Bobby Draper even does well like that. And other than Naomi being, I can't say the actress was necessarily bad, although I found her sort of off-putting. But the character seemed like it needed a lot of work. So it really got the universe building done well. It gave you this science fiction genre story that's very in-depth. And there were all these great characters, and it wasn't particularly woke. They made some mistakes. But as the narrative developed, it just seemed to go sour. It just seemed like the characters were no longer being consistent with themselves. What we were seeing them do wasn't a result of their growth. We got some really bizarre things that felt like filler. And you got this extended story. And that, I think, the extended stories with the Rain Builders and the settling of Laconia, which never got developed by the end, that I guess is from the novels, but not, it is dealt with in the novels, but they just sort of left you hanging. I felt like the show just did not know where it was going. And I think that leads to, this is the biggest problem in fiction, especially science fiction. It's an important point that Star Trek has always gotten right. Sorry, slightly dry there. When you create an elaborate universe like Star Trek did, you eventually have, there's different worlds, there's different star bases, there's places which recur in the series that recur in Star Trek The Next Generation and beyond. Above all, you created a situation that is really unlike anything else. You literally are part of a united federation of planets with your plan to go out and explore. That's not all they do. Obviously, there's other stories, there's star bases, there's colony worlds come under attack, there's bad guys. But nevertheless, the main thing that the show is about is consistent. And this, again, is one of the things they've really trashed with the new versions of Star Trek. You could literally just keep going forward in time and pick it up anywhere, and you know what your setup is. The networks are filled with situation comedies. They have been since before I was born, and that's all that it is. You put people in a situation, whatever their situation in life, and you write comedy pieces that fill in that time and space. Eventually, you run out of traction, you take some time off, you get a different formula or different characters, and you start. How many police dramas have there been in the history of television? After one gets old, you take a little break, you get some new characters in a new setting, and you do it again, right? There's an inevitable point at which stories begin to run out. Star Trek created a situation with that universe building that was unending. It was literally as endless as the cosmos, and you just had to keep moving forward in time. They moved forward for the next generation, and all those shows, Voyager, Deep Space Nine, they backed up for Enterprise. That did not go well. And we've been sort of muddling our way through the Star Trek universe with these prequels and other jumping around, and you're like, why? You were handed the best of all formulas. I'm talking about all this in detail because this is the downside of The Expanse and any really well done sci-fi universe. I don't know who's ever going to build something that has that lasting power that Star Trek does, or could, should, being ignored right now. The Expanse gave you this elaborate universe, but what it needed were stories that could continue to be set in the universe. Not necessarily episodic, but I think that's sort of the key. In Star Trek, you could do a season-long arc. You had a couple seasons of the Dominion War in Deep Space Nine. Or you could do episodic television. You could do it episodic movies. And you just kept whatever new thing was going to happen, you inserted in. In some sense, it's very much like a superhero genre. If you've got Superman, the defender of Earth, you got to keep bringing in bad guys that threaten the Earth and he saves the Earth. But you can do that forever, or at least until you lose interest. With Star Trek, you're traveling through the cosmos. You could meet anybody, do anything, and make it as weird as your imagination is able to imagine. With The Expanse, you had a universe that was finite and yet so well done, you could live there forever, except you've got a story to tell. And you got a story to tell about the proto-molecule, which they never finished. Not really, not in the show. Never really gave you sort of the end formula of that. And there are various places where the story could have ended when they opened the ring gates, could have ended before that. It could have, various places, the defeat of Marco could have happened earlier. But these are story arcs set in a universe that come to an end. They're not inherently part of the universe. It almost needs to have, had Tom Jane's character not died or gone off to the proto-molecule verse, to do something like his detective agency. Do a whole series of stories set around the system through things that he's investigating now as a private investigator or something like that, which would be quite a different genre, but it makes use of the elaborate universe you built. See, they built this elaborate universe in which you could have all these stories, but you fall into having a story that has to wrap up after a certain arc. You've had your war and all the destruction, and now that has inherently changed the nature and the politics of your universe. Then you go forward from there and you come up with something new. And I don't know what the answer is to that difficulty. I mean, I think that is why we see sci-fi franchises don't last. Battlestar Galactica, brilliant setup, but it's a conflict with the Cylons on your way to find a home. It's got to wrap up at some point, right? Star Wars, the epic struggle of the rebellion against the Empire, but it's got to wrap up at some point. Prequels were not great. Sequels were atrocious. That's nothing less than a crime against an intellectual property, what Disney has done to Star Wars. But nevertheless, you're telling a finite story that the best you can do is, with the Empire gone, rebuild the Empire. Come up with a new way to do a new Death Star that we're going to blow up. Because that universe is finite in that setting, you created this, you took a brilliant mythological epic sort of story that could be set anywhere. You set it in a galaxy far, far away a long time ago. You you have all of this mythos, but you're telling a story originally, the redemption of the father through the son and the hero's journey. It's got to come to a conclusion. So I'm always citing Star Trek as the example of the thing that never needed ever to reach a conclusion. Now, the nonsense they're doing with it now, God only knows how that's going to pan out, or when it does finally choke out and fail, if there'll be anything left. But you literally have been handed in the Star Trek universe the answer. You've got a universe that continually just goes forward to explore the universe, find new things, find new races, develop new alliances, new shit, but always from that same basic beginning. Your situation of your situation comedy, though it's not a comedy, the situation in which you begin from is consistent and the same, and you've got this universe that can just keep growing on itself. The Expanse, in the end, suffered the same fate as a lot of really good shows like Battlestar Galactica, like even Buck Rogers. In a sense, they didn't know exactly what to do with Buck Rogers. And Star Wars. Ultimately, the story has to come to an end. You can only draw it out so far. V was the other one I was going to mention. The original V, the good one. But eventually, everybody wants to see you defeat the visitors and drive them away. And then what do you do after that? You tried to turn it into a series anyway, and that just didn't work out, right? Because your story ultimately is finite. And the Expanse gave us this really expansive universe, this universe-built world in which things were set. But you can only draw it out so long, and they did not draw it out as long as could have been done with better writing, better adaptation of it to screen. And it's sad to see it go. But I really wish, and I've said this elsewhere, more and more as we live in the streaming world, we should be looking for things that have an end. And we've seen it with, as bad as Marvel's The Defenders was, it was a limited series intended to bring together those heroes for a season rather than a 3-hour movie, or, a Zack Snyder cut 3.5-hour movie, or a series of 3 movies before there's not enough attention. So just do a longer story, do a 10-hour story over 10 episodes. The Expanse could have been wrapped up this year, and it could have been wrapped up so much better. And the last couple of seasons could have been so much better if they'd known they were wrapping it up, if they'd had a plan for how to do this arc and wrap it up and let it be its own thing perpetually. Because otherwise, you're stuck with that difficulty of, you're not going to be Star Trek if you're going to come up with something that's going to last forever, presumably, possibly go on forever and keep going forward. You're going to have something that's going to be finite and limited, and you're best off to just have a plan for it. Whereas in the old days of network TV, you turned it into a series, you kept it on until the ratings stunk and nobody watched it anymore, and it died an ignoble death, and then something else would come on. We can fix that with the streaming culture if we know that we're doing it in a limited series. If they had done 3 seasons or 4 or 5 even of an arc for The Expanse, and then made plans to take time off, take like 5 years, 5 years later, pick it up with another Expanse series and tell a new story, then there would have been a lot more potential perhaps going forward. But that's going to be the difficulty. Growing up with Star Trek, you could imagine your ship, your crew, you could put yourself in the Star Trek universe. That's just so much harder to do with things like even Battlestar Galactica and Star Wars, to put yourself in a situation where ultimately your daydream is winning the conflict and the story ends, and then what do you do with it after that? And to put yourself in the Expanse, imagine yourself there. What do you do with that? There's got to be something you're doing, and then you wind up, and then it's done. I guess in the long run, it's too much like real life to be open to wild imaginings. Anyway, that's just some of my thoughts on The Expanse. I miss it, but I have missed it for a couple of seasons that it was still on, to be honest. But it's a good example of what quality stuff can be produced when we work for it, and I'd love to see more of it, and I appreciate it for what it was. And those first few seasons are something I will go back and probably binge again in the future. We'll see you here next time. Let me know what you think. Live long and prosper.